Chapter 15 is all about the Civil War. There's going to be a lot of charts, graphs, and maps. Let's start out with this one. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, which caused many states in the South to secede from the Union. Here's the Electoral College map. What's important about this is that you can see where the Union or the Republicans basically have their support, but you can see how divided the South is among its different factions. As a result of Abraham Lincoln becoming president and taking a tough stand on the spread of slavery, Southern states basically decide to secede from the Union. South Carolina is the first, and many other states follow. Some border slave states did not secede. Don't think for a minute that it was an easy decision to secede from the Union. It was very risky because there was a lot to lose. So here we go with the Civil War through maps, charts, graphs, and pictures, and I'm going to go fairly briskly. The first is the North and South being completely unequal on paper. The only thing the South leads in is cotton, but all the population, the money, the industrial strength, the infrastructure is all concentrated in the North. So at least on paper, it looks basically like the North would win this war. However, looks can be deceiving. In terms of population, you can clearly see that we have a distinction in terms of race. The free states have 98% white versus 66% white, as well as farms being dominated in the South, and a rural and urban population mix. So also railroad lines, you can clearly see that the railroad lines are very much dominated in the North as opposed to in the South. And in the North, the government will seize control of all of these railroad tracks, and in the South they will not, and that is going to be a factor in the war for the North being able to win it. Here's another graphic picture showing the resources in the North and South. Again, the big idea that the North has the power, the money, the manpower. So, in 1861, this is what America looks like. The Union states are in yellow. The Confederacy is in green. Men present for duty in the Civil War. Clearly an advantage for Union forces. And as time goes on, look at what starts to happen to the Confederate forces. It's simply a war of attrition. Who served in the military? Well, take a state like Ohio, which is pretty indicative of the Union. Some failed to report, some were held into service, some even hired a substitute. If you had money, you could get out of fighting, which is one of the ugly things about this war. To what extent and in what ways was the Civil War a war where the poor are fighting the war for the wealthy? Soldiers' occupations, most of them were farmers and mechanics and laborers. Very few were what you call white-collar kind of individuals, businessmen and professionals. So that kind of tells you the blue-collar nature, the working-class nature of this war. The leaders of the Confederacy. President Jefferson Davis, a Southern politician, is going to be the president of the South, and his vice president, Alexander Stephens. The Confederate White House, located in Richmond, Virginia, literally almost a stone's throw away from Washington, D.C. The Confederate seal, you can see, with God as our vindicator. And look who's on the white horse. It's George Washington. The North Civil War strategy is simple. It's called the Anaconda Plan. Strangle the South as though a snake strangles its prey. Blockade the South with ships. Invade the South from the north. Cut the South in half through the Mississippi River right here, and all should be fine. However, it's not going to be fine. Here's another picture of the Anaconda Plan. I think this one's an actually better picture. It kind of shows the Anaconda strangling the South. Lincoln had a rough time with generals Winfield Scott, Irwin McDowell, George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker, George Meade, George McClellan again. It's almost like Abraham Lincoln hired and fired his generals more than George Steinbrenner hired and fired managers of the Yankees in the 1970s and 1980s. The Union could never fully get a strong showing in war at the very beginning of the war. They were getting beaten by Southern forces that had fewer men but better generals. And so the course of the war was very difficult. The Union did not score decisive victories in the first 2 years of the war. Finally, Lincoln would settle on Ulysses S. Grant, who is a major player who's going to help win the Civil War and eventually become a United States president. McClellan's like, I can do it. Seriously, I can. And Lincoln's like, yeah, right. I gave you a second shot. Let's see what happens. The Confederate generals are a who's who of great generals. General Stonewall Jackson, George Pickett, James Longstreet, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Jeb Stuart, and of course the great Robert E. Lee. All of these guys are great strategists and tacticians using their knowledge of military tactics to defeat the Union Army and frustrate the Union Army in the first 2 years of the war. The first battle was called the Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, and it showed that this was going to be a dogfight. Troop strength almost even. However, you could say probably that this is either a stalemate in terms of total losses, or for the Union Army, a tremendous defeat. Other highlights in the Civil War, the Battle of the Ironclads, the first submersible boats, armored ships, battleships, taking place here and here, all throughout. Those are highlights of the Civil War, new technologies. The first, interestingly enough, I mean, these aren't only the first battleships, but also some of the first submersibles. In the North, you could buy your way out of military service. You could buy your way out of military service also in the South as well. This is one of the ways in which this war benefited the rich and the wealthy at the expense of the poor. In the East in 1861 to 1862, the primary battle to focus on is the Battle of Antietam Creek, because up till that point, the South was basically frustrating the North. The North had really no prospects to win. The South was very close to forging an alliance with Great Britain, and they were close, actually, Great Britain and even France, to recognizing the South as an actual country. And at Antietam Creek, this all changed. We'll try to talk to you about why this was. So this was a major and decisive battle and victory for the North. And after this, it convinced the French and the British not to back the South and not to recognize the South. Therefore, President Lincoln used this battle to, for the first time, take a moral cause for the war, making the war a war against slavery rather than just a war to save the Union. After the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issues what's called the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically says that all slaves, when the northern states come through and defeat them, defeat the South, will be free, freeing all the slaves. Okay? This makes the war about slavery. This doesn't make the war just about an internal security matter. It's about freeing the slaves. There's a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, as you can see. President Lincoln conferring with his fellows. And as a result, a tremendous amount of effort is going to be made to try to recruit African Americans into the military. And we're going to see that in the coming months and years of the Civil War. Blacks are going to be recruited. The movie Glory, which is a great film, it's about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This is the most famous African American regiment in the Civil War. However, it is far from the only regiment in the Civil War. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who's played by Matthew Broderick in the movie, has a monument to him. He came from a wealthy Massachusetts family, and he's the man who was responsible for leading the black soldiers into battle. African Americans fought everywhere in the Civil War, as you can see according to this map. Even they were freeing slaves, and they were kind of looked at as heroes by the slaves that were being freed. It's interesting to note that even the Confederates had blacks fighting for them at the end of the war, but as you can probably guess, many slaves used that as an opportunity to escape. The war in the West was decisively won by the Northern Union forces at the Battle of Vicksburg in Mississippi. And the culminating, most important battle that really, I think, broke the back of the South is the Gettysburg battle. And this was a tremendous casualty. This is where Robert E. Lee basically gets his clock cleaned, I guess you could say. And from then on, after 1863 up until 1864, it's going to be a dogfight for the South to even stay in the game. The North is going to start running out of men, and so they're initiating the draft in 1863, where you're forced to go fight in military service. Ethnic groups such as the Irish are going to be recruited to volunteer into New York City, for example, here in these pictures. Blacks are also going to be recruited, as you can see here. And there's also going to be draft riots where people are going to basically say that they don't want to fight in this war. It's an untold story of the war, but it's important to note that the war was not necessarily popular to fight among some. More pictures of the New York City draft riots here. As a result of all of this, the inflation in the South starts choking prices and making them go higher, choking the supply of things. As you can see, in some of these, it's a very difficult situation. So, the progress of the war, you can see that the Union is starting to gain. And you can also see that the South is starting to be beaten back. General Sherman is going to march to the sea, burning pretty much everything in his path. In 1864, the general that Lincoln fired is going to try to win the election, and he will fail. It's going to be Lincoln again, as you can clearly see. And so the final Virginia campaign to crush the South happens. You don't have to know any of these battles. You just have to understand that they happened. As a result, the South surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, ending the worst war the United States has ever fought in. Let me skip ahead to the next graph to show you the sheer amount of death. This is the most destructive war America has ever fought in. Thank you for your time. We'll talk about a little bit more of the Civil War in a very short lecture for concluding chapter 15.